Hi everyone, it's Mindrolling. I'm Raghu Marcus, as you well know by now, and I've got with me an old friend, and we haven't done this in a while. Mickey Lemle. Mickey, welcome.
Thank you, Raghu.
And Mickey, as many of you know, probably from all the work that Mickey's done and his connectivity to Ram Dass, of course, has just done an amazing new film with His Holiness the Dalai Lama called The Last Dalai Lama. It has a question mark at the end, which is something we'll get into here when we chat. But I think many of you, of course, know because of Ram Dass the film that Mickey did, Fierce Grace, which is pretty much a defining movie whenever we anybody wants to know more about Ram Dass and what happened with his stroke and all of that, we immediately turn them on to Mickey's movie, which is so fabulous. So, and Mickey's done other films. All of them are great. And he did a film with His Holiness called Compassion in Action a number of years ago, which is an interesting the way that these two films sort of not interact but stand as bookends to each other is also something I want to talk to you about, Mickey. But just let me know a little bit about what prompted you to do another film on His Holiness.
Well, when I made it's Compassion in Exile. When I made
Compassion in
Compassion,
Action, I said.
that,
That
that,
is that
that's
Trump or Rinpoche?
that's probably a book about somebody else. But anyway, 25 years ago, when I made the movie Compassion in Exile, nobody had done a movie about His Holiness, a major movie about His Holiness at that time, and he wasn't the world rock star that he is today. And for multiple reasons, I thought it would be a great movie. Um, I'd been thinking about it for about 8 years or more. I first met His Holiness in 1984 at a conference in Switzerland, and there was a small reception for him after he gave a talk, and I was fortunate enough to meet him in person, and I was just blown away by how funny he was. He was just not at all what I expected. He's very very funny, very surprising in his humor, and uh, and just one of the most fascinating human beings I'd ever met. He has this aura of presence. You just feel it when he comes into a room. There might be 1,000 people in the room, and you feel it. But when you're close up and you shake his hand, it's palpable. And I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this uh, have met powerful, charismatic people, politicians or celebrities, and they too might have an aura, um, which you can feel, and they'll look you right in the eye, and you're the only person in the room, but you can actually see the wheels turning, and they're thinking, who is this person, and how can I use them for me? But with His Holiness, you you he's looking right into your soul, and he's thinking, who is this person, and what do they need? How can I help them? So you're just overwhelmed by this sense of kindness. And actually, when I was interviewing his sister, I said, so what do you call him, like bro or and she said, oh no 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 no, we call him Kundun, which means the presence.
Wow, I didn't know that. Oh.
So that there was a lot of incentive to make the first movie, and 25 years ago we felt like if the world only knew what was going on in Tibet with the Chinese occupation, that something would have to change about it. And 25 years later, things haven't really changed except that they've gotten worse. And since then, over 150 Tibetans, mostly young people, have immolated themselves, set themselves on fire in protest to the Chinese occupation. And so things are very dire for the Tibetan culture and traditions, um, and His Holiness has changed over the last 25 years, and I've changed. Um, and I thought maybe it was a good time to do a new movie about him. Uh, I'm a member of the baby boomers, and as a friend of mine says, they're starting to shoot at our regiment now. So we're you know
That's a good way to put.
we're all dealing with aging and dying. And so I figured, as a gift to my generation, why not ask the world's most conscious person how he's dealing with it? Because he actually in July just turned 82, and we filmed around his 80th birthday.
Mm.
So uh, anyway, so there are multiple reasons. Also, I've I've been fortunate enough to see him pretty much every year, and I've observed in the last few years there's a kind of urgency to him uh, talking about what's important to him. And I thought maybe it would be good to capture that and amplify it to the world.
Mm. What do you see? What are some of the differences, and not just the big differences with His Holiness regarding what's gone on in Tibet and regarding his now not being involved in the political scene? But what do you see from then to now?
Well, one of the big things is 25 years ago, I was at, he met with cutting edge neuroscientists, um, and he challenged them pretty much, I think it was like 25 years ago. He said, look, we Tibetans have been holding this knowledge about how to overcome afflictive emotions, negative afflictive emotions like anger, jealousy, hatred, greed, violence, ignorance. He said, we've been holding this knowledge, and now it's time to give it to the world. It belongs to everybody. But if it comes from one spiritual tradition, the others won't buy it. So he challenged these scientists. He said, explore these methods. He didn't say prove it. He said explore it.
Mm.
And if you find value in it, spread it as widely as possible. And it's no coincidence that that was the start of this mindfulness movement that's spread all over the world now.
Mm.
And these a bunch of these cutting edge neuroscientists have been studying this using MRIs and all the technologies of modern neuroscience, and have shown definitively that your level of happiness is not something you're born with. It's something that you can increase. You can increase your level of happiness. You can increase your compassion. That the brain is malleable. It's called neuroplasticity, and it can rewire itself. And so these technologies that the Dalai Lama, that the Tibetan Buddhists have been holding, they've now shown that it actually works. And just the voice that we all hear in our heads, we all think is telling us the truth. But really, it's just our minds organizing phenomenon and creating a reality for us. But we think it's the truth. So we might see somebody and say, that guy's a real jerk. And then the next day you see him and say, that guy's a real jerk. And science has said, and I have no idea how they've shown this, but that 95% of the thoughts you have today, you had yesterday. So we just keep rethinking the same thoughts over and over and over again, which in a way is very reassuring. So if you see this guy, you say, he's a real jerk. You say, I've always thought he was a jerk. I am so smart and so perceptive that I know that this guy's a jerk. And it's just your mind creating that reality. Mm. And one of the great advantages of that one gets from a meditation practice is that you start to observe how your mind creates these thoughts, how these thoughts rise in your mind, and and the hounds are back, I hear, and one starts to identify with the witness to the thoughts and not with the thoughts themselves, and that is actually the technology for overcoming negative afflictive emotions. And in fact, it's also the technology for world peace. The Dalai Lama said, somebody asked him if we would have world peace. He said, yes. He said, eventually, he said, all that's required is for each individual human heart to be transformed. He said, it's a long process, but it's the only way. And so there's the technology, and it's now being spread. And I thought, and so a good portion of the movie is dedicated to that, looking at these two uh, emotional psychologists, Eve Ekman and her father, Paul Ekman, both renowned psychologists, who the Dalai Lama commissioned to create a map of emotions or an atlas of emotions so that you can start to see how your emotions work and how they create your reality.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Ekmans, that part of the movie, and it was also quoted by the review, that wonderful review that you got in the New York Times, that was done on the film, rather. And it pointed to that little part of the movie. I mean, the affection that His Holiness, who is so affectionate uh, all the time, every time I've seen him. And I actually have seen him a lot, but never one-on-one. But I've never felt a loss in that way. I've been very fortunate, obviously, to be with Neem Karoli Baba and Karmapa 16th and so on. So, it would be hard for me to feel a loss on any level. But because he is so connective, doesn't matter. As you mentioned, it could be a huge audience or a one-on-one. You absolutely are. He connects with everybody. And so in the film, this connection with actually his daughter, Paul's daughter, I guess.
You're not His Holiness's daughter.
Yeah, right.
Just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. It won't be like Ram Dass suddenly finding out he had a son. No,
I
not
have a
going to
daughter.
happen. But so I just wanted to let you know, and I'm sure you know this story, but it's worth repeating. I did a podcast with Paul
Oh,
because of what I saw in the movie, and I loved his whole thing around emotions, and I thought it would be very instructive and informative for all of us to share who listen on the Be Here Now network and Mindrolling. And he told me a fascinating story. How many times, for instance, have you heard His Holiness say, I do not have any psychic powers, or I do not have any powers, right? Doesn't he? He
yeah,
says that all the time, right?
yeah, yeah. I don't believe it, but he says it.
Yeah. So meanwhile, Paul Ekman says to me, I have had a horrible affliction my entire life around anger,
Mm.
which piqued my interest because I also have that affliction. Most of us do in one way or another, but
I think his mother committed suicide, and he blamed his father,
uh-huh.
who was very overbearing and abusive, and so he had this lifelong anger issue.
Mm. So he sat. It was just in the process of meeting him. He got the opportunity to meet His Holiness, and he just sat next to him, and I think His Holiness just held his hand for some time, and after that meeting, he said to me, "I don't know what to tell you. I'm a scientist." But after that meeting, and after he held my hand and we sat next to each other, I never had that problem again. Did he tell you that?
I did a long interview with him, which is actually not in the movie, but it's an extra on the DVD.
Mm.
And he told me that story. And um, you know, because you've been with Neem Karoli Baba and the Karmapa and stuff, I have heard this, and I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a scientist, and I have no way of proving any of it. But I've heard that if you have a petri dish and you put a cell from your heart into the petri dish, it will beat. And if you put another cell from another heart in the petri dish, it will beat at a different syncopation.
Mm.
But if you put them near each other, they syncopate and they start to beat the same. And I believe, just through my own experience, that when you're around these great beings, that your heart starts to beat in sync with theirs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a wonderful analogy too. But let's go back a little bit because I want to my question around the difference uh, between your first encounters and doing that first movie, Compassion in Exile. You should do one, Compassion in Action, okay, Mickey?
This is
With
my next project.
yeah, and the new movie, the Last Dalai Lama. But just on a personal level, what you were actually in connection with him on a personal level from that time to this time.
Well, I have to say that every movie that I've been blessed to make with these great beings, I can see my worldview shift. Um, it happened, spending time with Ram Dass, obviously, initially, with Joseph Campbell, with Sir Lawrence Vanderpost, with His Holiness. Um, and when I did Compassion in Exile, my worldview shifted, and I got from that experience of, and let me just back up for a second. It's not just that I spend time with these beings filming, which is phenomenal, and I remember every shooting day. Um, uh, Partially for all the stuff I didn't get and what went wrong, but I do remember every shooting day, and um, but then I get to edit. So I sit in an editing room watching these great beings all day long for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for maybe a year, and I treat editing as a meditation. So when I'm about to watch a sequence or the rushes, which is the just raw material, I totally empty and like I'm getting ready to meditate. And because I want to watch it as if it's for the first time, because as the director, I have to put myself in the position of the audience who will be seeing it for the first time. Um, and so I'm really meditating on the deepest questions in my life, and I feel really blessed. I mean, how many people there get to say that their work every day is to meditate on the issues that keep them awake at 3 in the morning, and as it's uh, proposed by some of the great minds on the planet. Anyway, so after the first movie, Compassion in Exile, I really got that happiness comes from service.
Hmm.
It's not from getting more stuff or you know winning awards or whatever. It's about helping people. And this last time around on the last Dalai Lama question mark, I really got all this stuff about how we create our own reality through our minds, and that I felt like in a way that was also one of the major themes of Fierce Grace, is because the one thing that I felt connected each of the phases in Ram Dass's life was his understanding, both first as a psychologist, and then as a religious seeker, and then as somebody devoted to service, and then as somebody with a stroke, that he really viscerally gets that you create your own reality through a projection of your mind. And I have to just say, the average life expectancy for somebody with a stroke like his, being paralyzed on one side and some speech aphasia, I think it's 3 to 5 years. And he's now, I think, over 20 years having had
It's
this stroke.
20 years, yeah.
I think it was 20 years in February. And I, I don't know if anybody keeps a record of this, but this is phenomenal. And so when I did uh, uh, the last Dalai Lama, I really got that we create our own reality with our minds. And so after I'd finished the film about a year ago, I had two things that I wanted to do on the same weekend. One was in Denmark and one was in England. And I debated for a while as to which one I really wanted to do. And I chose to go to England to this a wedding of a friend of mine. And immediately I regretted not going to Denmark. And so when I get into regret, I can spiral very quickly into all of my life's regrets. The girls in high school I never kissed, the movies I didn't make, the turns I didn't make, and I can get lost in it for days. And so what I found that summer while I was in England with my friends in a beautiful place was anytime I started a sentence in my mind with, if only I had, I was destined to at least 4 hours of misery. So I caught it. I learned to catch it after the first sentence. It's like, if only I had. And then I said, okay, you've got a choice. Do you want to spend the next 4 hours in regret, or do you want to enjoy your friends? And so that's what I got from this last go around.
No, that's terrific. And it's interesting too. I mean, because you're, talking about. I mean, one of the core premises in the movie is the Tibetan Buddhist technology for overcoming afflictive emotions. Is really something extraordinary to share with your audience. I mean, it's this ability, this technology that they have developed over these many, many, many centuries. And as you say, the fact that you are in there in the trenches making this movie with him, and at the same time you're absorbing for your own being these teachings, is there's a lot of grace there, Mickey. That's for sure.
I feel really fortunate. I must have done something right in my previous lives.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it, we're talking about that. I mean, the only reason, isn't it amazing? I mean, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but I'm sure this has occurred to almost everybody who has partaken with Tibetan teachings in the West. And that's the idea that only because the Chinese took that action and did what they did are we having the benefits of this incredible ancient technology. What a crazy thing, right?
It's when the great fifth, he's called the great fifth Dalai Lama, and he built the Potala Palace that we in all the pictures. And when he died, they were still working on the Potala, on the palace, and the people, the regents, knew that if word went out that the Dalai Lama was dead, all the work would stop and they'd never finish it. So for 12 years, they didn't tell anybody that the Dalai Lama had died.
No.
And nobody knew. He was that, isolated or kept that removed. And, so we've been absolutely blessed by the Dalai Lama, his teachings, the way he's affected so many things in the world. I mean, there's a sequence in the movie that we shot in British Columbia, in Vancouver, of two schools.
Yeah, fantastic part.
And that all started. There was a conference, a panel on education in Vancouver in 2005. And His Holiness was on the panel with Desmond Tutu and Zalman Schachter and people. And when it came time for His Holiness to speak, it was almost like a throwaway comment. He said, I look at Western education, and it's really good at training minds, but it's not good at training hearts. And a trained mind without a trained heart can be very dangerous. And from that moment, they instituted a policy in Vancouver to teach social and emotional training as required. And so it's now spread to all of British Columbia. It's mandated that they must teach social and emotional training in every school, K through college. And now it's beginning to spread through all of Canada, and hopefully it'll spread, unless we build a wall against it, uh,
No,
you know,
I'm from Canada. We're building the wall
to keep the
to keep.
Americans
Yes,
out
exactly.
in
Yeah,
case Trump runs for a second term.
yeah.
But that's it's already spreading. Some woman was at a screening. The movie's now out in theaters, and I just
Hmm.
need to plug it. If you
Yes.
look at lemlepictures.com, Lemle pictures.com, you can see it, the theaters that it's showing in. You can see where it's coming, and there's also a place at the bottom to request it to come to your community. So I highly recommend that. But this woman in New York, in one of the audiences, said, "We're now doing this in New York." So, and our good friend Danny Goldman is instrumental in a lot of it.
Mm. Oh,
As
terrific.
and
Absolutely. Uh, so, given all of this, Mickey, how, I was just thinking about this before we got on uh, to chat. The title of the movie with the question mark, The Last Dalai Lama. How in the world? I can't even conceive of a world without His Holiness. I mean, it's staggering to his influence and is so pervasive through so many stratas of society around this world, and what he gives. I mean, I can't conceive of it. Can you? I mean, I
you know, I mean, look, this particular incarnation, he's the 14th incarnation of the Dalai Lama, and I think that years from now, after he's gone, we're all going to marvel at the fact that he was alive when we were alive, that he was walking on the planet when we were walking on the planet. It's like, somebody like Gandhi. I mean, I think he wasn't really appreciated fully for what he did until after he was gone, and Martin Luther King and for that matter, Jesus and the Buddha, you know. Uh, and that was part of the impulse to make the movie, is that this 20, 30 years from now, when people want to know who was perhaps the greatest Dalai Lama and who was perhaps the last Dalai Lama, they're going to turn to my two movies, and um, as part of understanding who this great being was that walked with us,
mm,
and taught us so much. um, uh, you know I I've known him for 35 years, and I've heard him say many things at different times about his reincarnate, whether or not he was going to reincarnate as the Dalai Lama. Just to clarify, all Hindus and all Buddhists believe in rebirth, but it's only the Tibetans that believe that a being or can reincarnate into a position like the Dalai Lama. So, like in Tibet, like the head of Harvard Medical School would be a reincarnate position, so that when the head of Harvard Medical School would die, instead of getting together an academic search committee to find a
yeah.
candidate, they would get a group of Rinpoches and Lamas together to go find a 2.5-year-old. And that kid would go through a 23-year course of study, uh, ending with virtually a doctorate in philosophy. They'd also be trained in some of the technologies of what their position was going to be. But also, one thing that intrigues neuroscientists today, and they're looking into, is that these young children, are called tulkus, and part of their training is meditating on compassion every day, starting when they're about 5, and it's while their brains are in formation. And so, what's the effect of meditating on compassion while the brain is being formed? Because if you put one of these tulkus, when they're in their 20s or 30s or 40s or whatever, in an MRI machine, what they do is they show pictures of happy human life, puppies and picnics,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden there'll be a picture of like a war or some atrocity, and the part of the brain then that controls compassion lights up. If you feel any compassion, if you're a sociopath, it doesn't light up at all. But for us people, it would light up. for these monks and tulkus, it takes up a huge amount of space. So, and they've also shown that with just a few months of meditation training, meditating on compassion, that you can increase the amount of your brain that lights up when you see these pictures. So it's not, as I said earlier, it's not something you're born with. It's something you can learn. It's like a skill.
Yeah, cultivation for sure, which is the purpose of practice.
That's
All
why
of
it's called
practice.
practice.
That's
It's
why it's
called
called
practice.
practice. Yeah, but it is great that we're getting, through His Holiness and the work he's doing with Richie Davidson and all these people and Danny, that we are getting confirmation that around neuroplasticity, where it is true that you can change. That just putting it in the most simple of terms, and that is a very hopeful and promising thing for all of us, especially in this world today.
Right. And when you say you can change, it's not because your wife is nagging you to change and start,
Yeah,
stop leaving your socks and underwear on the floor. It's change for your own benefit. You're actually benefiting yourself. It's not for other people.
yeah,
Although there is a benefit for other people, but it's really so that you're happier.
yeah. And you will probably pick up after yourself and
Yeah,
get the wife to stop nagging you. Probably
out of
that'll happen too.
yeah, out of compassion for your wife,
Yeah,
who has to clean up after you.
yeah, exactly. So it's spent in this the making of the Last Dalai Lama. Um, just tell us a little bit. Just some. I mean, you're spending this much time. I know you went to India more than once. I remember you telling me that you were going on your way over there to hang out with him and speak with him. And there had to be so many moments off camera or stuff that give us a little bit of spice, a little bit of anecdotes around interacting with him.
Well, um, after I made Compassion in Exile, a year after I finished it, it showed at uh, the Bombay Film Festival, and then there was a week hiatus, and it was showing at the first international film festival in Kathmandu. And I had been in the Peace Corps in Nepal, and I couldn't wait to introduce the movie in Nepali. But I had this week, and I decided, well, what the hell? I'll go hang out with His Holiness. And
What the hell? Yeah.
what the hell? And it turned out to be Tibetan New Year, which is their holiest day of the year. And I stay with his brother, who has a small guest house that used to be where his mother lived. And it's very charming. And one morning, it was like 5 in the morning, he woke me up. He said, come on, come on, come on. I said, where are we going? He said, come with me, come with me. And we went up to the roof of his temple, and there was the Dalai Lama sitting with a row of 100 monks in the dark, saying prayers and drinking chai and throwing barley into the air, blessing the new year. And then the sun came up, and as it broke the horizon over the foothills of the Himalayas, an eagle came and sat in the tree right behind His Holiness, and it was quite spectacular. And
Mm.
a couple of days later, I had a private audience with him, and I was I was going to ask him. I'd always asked him questions and stuff related to work because I was always working on the movie. But I'd seen a lot of people when people would come to me and say, "I'm meeting the Dalai Lama tomorrow. What should I do?" I said, ask him a question. And they said, well, what should I ask? And I said, I don't know, but I would ask him the deepest question in your heart, the thing that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. Like, don't waste it on, hey, how about those Knicks? You know, um, and you have a rare opportunity. It might be once in your lifetime. So take advantage of it, because there's certain things that only he can answer. You know, so I was going to ask him some technical things about my next movie, but at the last minute, I just decided, look, I should take my own advice. And I was going through. Um, I separated from my then wife and my child's mother. My son was 3 years old. We had tried to mediate for like a year, and we got that close, and then she thought, well, if he's willing to do it, it must be a bad deal for me. And she
Mm.
just said, I can't do this anymore. I'm turning it over to my lawyer, who had been Mia Farrow's lawyer against Woody Allen, and she
No.
was like a terrible human being. And I was trying to avoid court because I knew we were going to have a lifelong relationship, regardless of whether we were married or not, because we had a son together, who we both loved and adored. Um, and so I asked His Holiness about it, and he said, "Well, what's the problem?" And I said, "I just can't seem to reach her, on a human level. It's like there's this block of ice between us." And then he asked me a bunch of questions about my son and all this other stuff. And he said to me, "You must stand up for what's right." He said, "You can't let people roll over you."
Hmm.
He said, "Just don't be attached to the outcome." And in fact, that's the same advice that Krishna gives Arjuna at the heart of the Bhagavad
Yeah.
Gita.
Yeah.
Do what you do it impeccably. Don't be attached to the outcome.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be just, I realized I had to go to court. I couldn't avoid that. I had to get a good lawyer and do that. But I had to let go in my mind of how I wanted it to turn out.
Yeah. Mm.
And so it was actually, I could relax thinking there was something else I could do to avoid court.
Mm. Wow.
And it worked out great. Uh, um, After a few months, um, my ex-wife and I are very, very good friends. Um, we She comes over for Christmas with my son, and now in the last couple of years, she's brought her new husband, and it's just the four of us, and the Jew makes the Christmas dinner. Um, um,
um,
and I'll just tell a very quick story. When my son was about 10, and I got, by the way, the thing that I was concerned about in the divorce was, in New York State at that time, the rubber stamp was the father got to see the child every other weekend and Wednesday nights. And that's not being a real parent to me. So I fought to have what turned out to be the best custody arrangement possible. I had 9 straight days, and then she had 12 straight days.
uh-huh. Beautiful.
He came to me Friday night for the weekend, the week, and the weekend.
Mm.
Then he went Sunday night to her for the weekend, for the week, the weekend, and the week. And we did this from the time he was 3. And anyway, so one time when he was about 10, it was a Saturday, and she called me and said, is Aaron there? We'd been away somewhere, and she said, is Aaron up? I said, yeah, he just got up. He's in the shower. I'm making omelets. Do you want to come have breakfast? She said, sure. So she lives just a few blocks away, and it was no big deal. The three of us, we had meals together all the time, and you know, so we're having omelets and chatting. And she said, I should probably tell you, I just got a new doctor, and I put you down as my medical proxy.
Mm.
And I said, I am deeply moved by this ovation of trust. I mean, what greater trust could a person have in,
Mm.
let me practice, pull the plug. And my son said, Dad. And then the next week, we were having just a minor disagreement about where Aaron, my son, was going to spend Friday night for dinner, because we both made arrangements. So we're having a minor argument. And at one point, I said to her, look, if you don't straighten up about this and you go into a coma, the first thing I'm going to have them do is breast implants. And she said, I really need to rethink this. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I, we're very, very close. She just last week came to my birthday party with her
Mm.
husband, and so it works out.
Mm. Yeah, well, the little blessing from His Holiness sounds to me like.
Yeah.
Mm. Beautiful. So since we talked about, you talked a little bit about first meeting with His Holiness all those years ago. What about first meeting with Ram Dass?
I first met him in the early 70s. I think it was like 73. I was on the vineyard, staying with my friend Peter Simon, who's a photographer, old friend of Ram Dass's. And he said, hey, listen, there's this guy giving a talk in the local church in Vineyard Haven tonight. You really should come." And I said, "Well, who is it?" And he said, "His name's Ram Dass." And I said, "Oh, is he an Indian?" He said, "No, he's Jewish." I thought, right, I'm going to go hear some Jew with an Indian name giving a talk in a church. I said, I've got a lot of other things I really should be doing, like buying ice cream. And my friend Peter said, no, 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 you really have to do it. So he convinced me at least to sit in the last row on the aisle so that after 20 minutes I could leave and tell him at least I had seen him. And 4 hours later, I was totally transfixed. Still, I mean, my mind, for the 4 hours he talked, my mind never wandered to the past or the future or to anything else I could be doing. I was totally focused on every single part of the stories that he was telling. And I'd read some philosophy in college, but this was the first time I kind of got it. And it's because he would wrap it in personal experience. And this, he would go from personal experience to these metaphysical realms in a way that I would understand them, and then back to his personal experience seamlessly. And I consider myself a storyteller, and I've met three great storytellers in my life, and he is certainly one of them. Because, as I said, the acid test is, does your mind wander? And if it doesn't for several hours, that's a good storyteller.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the essence of what he talked about that night, I still remember all these years later, was that we're both human and divine simultaneously. And the problem is, if you go too far into being human, then you're just going to suffer. As my Tibetan friends tell me, if you take on an incarnation, you're taking on suffering. You're gonna get sick. You're gonna die. People around you are gonna die. You're gonna hold on to your tech stocks way too long. Things like that. You're not going to be able to lose the 20 pounds your doctor tells you, and so forth. But if you go, and Ram Dass said, but if you go too far into being divine, you run the risk of forgetting your zip code, and that can become problematic. So that the art form is to dance in the tension between the two and hold them both. And here I am, however many, 40 years later, still remembering it. And I thought, well, we've got ourselves quite a boy here. And so every time he would be in a city where I was, I would go hear him, and then I would do retreats in Western Mass, and I flew to Esalen one weekend to spend with him. And over time, he recognized me, but he didn't really know me. But then, and I can't remember exactly the year. It was before the stroke. He wanted to do a slide show because he was going to 36 cities every year and traveling all the time. And he wanted to put together a still picture show with his voice. And he was having some trouble with it. And several of his friends said, "You got to talk to Mickey about this." And so finally they set it all up, and I watched it, and I said, "Look, it's great. All you need to do is take the beginning and put it at the end, and take the end and put it in the middle." And I basically restructured it for him. And at first he was like, "Wait a minute." And then he actually saw how it would work better. And then after that, we became friends, and he actually married me and my former wife in a wonderful ceremony. And we just became friends after that. And I remember it was a couple of months after the stroke. And for those people who don't know, it was really touch and go for the first month and a half. I know the doctors told Jai that he was either going to be a vegetable or die. He was never going to make any improvement. He couldn't swallow and couldn't speak, and was still paralyzed on half his body. And little by little by little, he just made these improvements. And I remember when I was interviewing him for Fierce Grace, at one point I said, "RD, I always thought that Eastern wisdom traditions teach us that if you have expectations and your reality doesn't come up to your expectation, change your expectation, because the gap between the two is where your suffering lies. So just change your expectation. So I said, I've been filming you doing physical therapy, walking therapy, speech therapy, aqua therapy, and all of them are painful for you. I said, why don't you just accept the fact that you're in a wheelchair, and you're not, and stop struggling.
Hmm.
And he looked at me and he said, I said, accept it as God's will and stop struggling. And he said, I've learned it's also God's will to struggle.
Hmm. Wow.
You
You
know,
never told me that. That's
yeah, no, I filmed it, and then, a film has its own structure, and
mm,
some great things just don't fit.
mm, yeah.
And so then only I get to know about it unless I do a podcast.
Yeah. Well, yeah. He's doing that to this day, struggling. I mean,
Yeah.
and he's. I have. If I have 1/10 of the courage to struggle in that way, and to bear the kind of pain and suffering that he goes through, I'd be very happy. I mean, he is really a. And for those of you out there, by the way, we're talking about with Mickey Lemle about Fierce Grace, a movie which is the defining movie. I mean, there's not a lot of movies. Yeah, there's movies about Ram Dass, but certainly the defining film about Ram Dass going through this very, very, I mean, as Mickey said, life-threatening and very difficult passage over time of struggling to get back to a place where he can actually communicate in any way and share who he is. And, Mickey, I think you'll agree with me. Many people say, Ram Dass used to be able to talk about it, quote unquote, the path, spirituality, unraveling, like no one else. And now that he cannot express himself in that way, although we've been filming him for, like 12, 13 years now on Maui, and he certainly has said a lot of great things that are tremendously informative and useful teachings for people. But he is what he was talking about before the stroke, right? I mean, that's the simplest
Yeah.
way to put it.
Y- you know, um, I I know I was speaking to people that would see him right after the stroke. He was in the hospital, I believe, for 2 months, and it was very touch and go. As I said, the doctor said he was either going to die or be a vegetable, but he wasn't going to improve, and he was right on the edge of dying. And one day, Jai told me, he said he decided he wants to live.
Hmm.
And I believe, and I've never actually asked Ram Dass this, but I believe he thought, I'm going to come back from this and show the baby boomers how to deal with it, with aging and illness and death. I'm
Right.
going to do it for them. As far as I'm concerned, it was just up to him. It's like, okay, I'm out of here.
Hmm.
But I think he did it in service, and think of all the millions of people now that he's touched, uh, personally, through the workshops, through the work you're doing, through the podcast, and through Fierce Grace to a certain extent. Um, he's touched millions and millions of people, and as I said, the life expectancy of somebody with that kind of stroke is 3 years, four
Yeah.
years, something
No.
like that.
No.
My uncle had the exact same stroke. My uncle was like the super macho. He flew B-29s during World War II when he was 22, and he skied half the year, and he could do chin-ups on the door jams, and he drank and ate, was a sybarite, and he had the stroke, and every single day he woke up in hell because he thought, there's been a mistake in the system. This is not who I am, and not who I was supposed to be. And so he just suffered tremendously for the last 3 years of his life, and then just finally said, I'm done, I'm out of here.
Hmm.
But RD has shown us that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Yeah.
There's still grace,
Yeah.
and when I was in the middle of making the movie, it was going to be called Being Here Now. That was the working title. And one day I was at some reception and met a woman. I was just in the beginning part of the making the movie, and she said, I was a student of Richard Alpert's at Harvard, and I've followed him over the years. And she said I would listen to his teachings, but I never really totally believed him. It all sounded nice, but I didn't totally believe him. She said, since the stroke, and I've seen how he's dealt with it, I now believe him.
Hmm.
So I
Wow.
thought, here's this person who's been a teacher in some form or other for 50 years, and to have all of his teachings validated because of how he's dealing with the stroke
Hmm.
is really grace. And that night I changed the title to Fierce Grace.
Wow. Really? Huh. Oh man. And then just to say, Ram Dass, tell everybody, Ram Dass for years thought, uh, well, you gave me the stroke and then allowed me to work through it or whatever. And then one day he actually went to India uh, to meet with, to go back to Kenchi, this ashram where we all used to hang out with Neem Karoli Baba Maharaji, and to see the resident saint there, who's our spiritual mother named Siddhima, who's still alive today, actually. And he went to her and he somehow mentioned the fact, that Maharaji somehow got to her that Maharaji had given him the stroke. And she fiercely looked at him and said, Ram Dass, Maharaji's not giving anybody a stroke, okay? Nature, the stroke resulted in nature. In other words, whatever he was doing, and he was doing some not good shit around his lifestyle. If anybody, you can see pictures. He looks better now than he did before he got the stroke. I mean, as wild as that sounds, and I'm being a little dramatic, but not that much, and Mickey knows that. Um, she said, the grace was in you having, and she didn't say it in exactly these words, but you having, Maharaji gave you a perspective from which to transform the suffering, and that was the grace. He gave you the grace to be able to continue, and part of it, I'm sure, is also his, because his whole thing from the minute he got back from India the first time was about, I've got to give this pearl to everyone that I meet. That is the core thing that's inside Ram Dass that makes him who he is. And I'm sure it was the same. I'm going to use Maharaji's grace, and I'm going to tough this out, and I'm going to struggle, and I want people to use me as an example. I'm sure he's never voiced that, Mickey. I don't think he's at all. It just is. He just did it. He is doing it. And
That's his whole life.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
it's it's the message of his whole life
Yeah,
for the last 20 years.
yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you for making that movie, and this movie is so great. The Last Dalai Lama, question mark at the end.
Question mark.
Yeah, it is just absolutely wonderful. I can't urge people to go see it any more strongly than out of connecting with His Holiness in the way that Mickey did in this movie, and allowing people in to never mind what he's saying, and never mind even the whole thing around the technology of the Tibetans and how he's passing that forward and getting it confirmed by science, all of those things. You know what, Mickey? It's the little touch where he places his hand on someone's cheek and give the love and compassion that is expressed in this movie is just it's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, and
Thank
I
you.
thank you for it.
Thank you.
And I love him, and as I say, I can't imagine a world without him right now, especially the one we're living in. Let me tell you. So everybody go to so Mickey, what's about Lemle film?
Lemle Pictures
Lemle
dot
Pictures
com.
dot com.
L Lemle Pictures, one word, Mindrolling.com.
Yeah, and you'll be able to.
And there'll be a list of all the
Oh, where?
theaters where it's showing currently and where it's coming. And as I said at the end, if you fill it in and say, please bring it to,
Yeah. Asheville.
Minneapolis,
Bring it to
Asheville.
Asheville, please.
Exactly. You can do
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
and the distributors will pay attention to
Right.
that.
Okay. We'll do that. And that'll all be up in the show notes on the Mindrolling page on BeHereNowNetwork.com. And by the way, if you're happening to be listening to this a year from this is 2017 in August. And if you're listening in February of 2018, by that time, I'm sure Mickey's going to make it available, and we're going to put it all up where you can download it or buy a DVD. Right, Mickey? Next year it'll be available that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
As soon as it's done with the theatrical run, the DVDs and downloads will be available.
Right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Mickey, for being
Thanks,
here. I
Raghu.
love hanging out with you. And everybody, this is Mindrolling, and we'll see you next week on the Be Here Now Network.